fine. So I said that we were going to continue with Breuer's analysis of the sale of Marat Machpelah. Now, I will note, he has a very, I'll quickly summarize how he gets to this point, though I'm not fully convinced of everything. What for him is central, I'm not 100% sure is necessary. It's interesting. What for him I think is almost secondary, I think makes a lot of sense. So he is really trying to interpret the Ibn Ezra here, who says that you learn two things from this parsha. One is Ma'alat Eretz Yisrael Kol Haratzot L'Chayim U'L'Meitim, the benefit of Israel for the living and the dead, whatever that means, and that God fulfilled his word to Avram that he would have a nachala. Now, based on this, he develops a thesis, which is true in general. I'm just not sure it's necessary here. It's true in Kol HaTorah Kula, that there are two kedushot to Eretz Yisrael, right? The Lamdanim call it, there's Shem Eretz Yisrael and Kedusha Eretz Yisrael. The Ritva calls it Kedusha Eretz Yisrael and Chibat Eretz Yisrael. He calls it the Kedusha Hatluya b'mitzvot and the Kedusha Hatluya b'am Yisrael, or something like that, or be'etzem. But basically the thesis goes like this, that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael that actually generates the Kiyum mitzvot depends on its actual acquisition by the Jewish people. And that's why the Israel wasn't Kadosh until Yeshua, and then after Galut Rishon, so we paskin there was no Kedusha Eretz Yisrael between Yeshua and then Ezra, and then we think that the second Kedusha is forever, right? But there's something about the actual dwelling of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael that gives it Kedusha for the purpose of mitzvot. But what everyone has noted is that there is a second level of Kedusha, which again, he calls, the Kedusha, the intrinsic Kedusha, others call it the Shem Eretz Yisrael, Chibet Eretz Yisrael. But it's basically, there is also a notion that Eretz Yisrael has a certain level of Kedusha or importance that's independent of that Kedusha. What's the proof? That you have a mitzvah to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Meaning, if Eretz Yisrael only becomes Kadosh at all once you conquer it, then there's no mitzvah to conquer it. That makes no sense, right? There has to be some sort of significance, call it what you want, that makes it that this is the land that we should conquer and grant it the full level of Kedusha, right? So, now it may be that those Kedusha apply to different parts of the land, and the Rav has a full analysis of this, and Rav Breuer thinks that's what's going on here, right? That this story is about those two things, that there's the first level of Kedusha, Shem, Eretz Yisrael, because Hashem already promised it, and this is the first case of someone actually buying land where you see the second Kedusha, right? So he thinks that this story is about that. Okay, I don't think you need it for this story, but I think his second part of the analysis is very necessary to the story. So he has a few interesting points. He says, first of all, he thinks that it is important that the first story of a Jew or a pre-Jew acquiring Eretz Yisrael is specifically for Yerusha. Right? It's for inheritance. Why? Because he says as follows. When a live person buys land, that is temporary, by definition. The only way for a living person to make it that the land is his forever is at a national level. Because a person can never be sure that it'll stay within his family forever, right? Even if he has heirs, right? First of all, he might sell it. And even if he doesn't and it goes to his children, they might sell it. Or maybe whatever, something will happen. People can't be assured that the land that they buy is eternally theirs. A nation can, because you can say, this is the this is the land of the Jewish people, and therefore even after every person has died, it belongs to this corporate entity that survives past the life of any person that actually made up that entity. But there's one exception, and that's a burial plot. Right? When a person buys something as a grave, it's actually forever, because the body is now there forever, right? It is now a burial plot. Right? So he thinks that the reason the first story, the first symbolic moment of a Jew or pre-Jew acquiring Eretz Yisrael had to be one of Yerusha, because then it can be an act of an individual acquiring land forever. Which is, I think, an interesting point. But then he says, okay, he thinks it's not accidental that this was the land that was chosen. Because he says, right, one of the key theses that the Ramban introduces throughout Breshit is this notion that Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, that what the Avot do is supposed to be symbolic. So he says, okay, Avram is clearly in some way therefore prefiguring the inheritance of Eretz Yisrael. And according to him, he thinks that it's, right, that becomes most symbolic when you inherit, when you buy a burial plot. And therefore, this is the moment where Avram needs to show his ownership. So what does he do? You get this long, extended acquisition story to prove that we really have rights to this land, right? So he said this whole story is basically taking the first symbolic acquisition, making an eternal one by being about a burial plot, and telling you a very long story of the negotiations we went to prove that we really have rights to this, that the first thing that we really bought, we got forever, and we did it above board, checked every box, etc. But where did we do it? In what piece of land? Marat HaMachpelah, which is in what city? Chevron. And he says, why is that important? Because Chevron is the birthplace of Malchut Yehuda. Because it is the capital of what? There's like something going on. You got to yell. Very good. That when David first becomes king, and he's only the Melech over Malchut Yehuda, he makes his capital in Chevron. So Chevron is therefore symbolic of the beginning of Malchut Yehuda. Now Malchut Yehuda eventually moves to where? Yerushalayim. And he says, well, guess what happens in Navi when we have the story of Yerushalayim? We get another story about David going to Arav Nahiyavusi and buying the land for full money. Right? So he said, what do you get? You have this notion that basically this act prefigures, it symbolizes our first acquisition. So, when you're dealing at the level of an individual, i.e. Abraham, the only way to symbolize eternal acquisition is by buying a burial plot. But that sets in motion the beginning of Malchut Yehuda. So when David starts his Malchut, he starts in Chevron. And then, when he moves it to Yerushalayim, so now he's moving the symbolism from Chevron to Yerushalayim, you get basically this story 2.0. Again, David buys the land, right? There's a story that goes out of its way to say we have claim to it. Except, when David buys it, he doesn't need to buy it as burial land. He can buy it as acquisition because he's acting as king, as sovereign. And as a king, you can buy something forever because now it's owned by the nation. He bought, right, focusing with Makom HaMikdash and Ir David, right, not modern day Jerusalem, obviously. But then he goes farther and he says, there's one other land in Israel that the Avot go out of their way to acquire. What is it? Shem. Correct. But at the end of the day, in the time of the Avot, we only have two cities that we really, really own. One is this part of Chevron, and the other is Shrem, which Yaakov gets during the battle with with Shrem. And then he says, okay. No, but it's one where Yaakov himself says, I got it. B'charbi v'kashti, meaning, yeah, in the end of the day, I got it. It wasn't provo, whatever. But he says Shem is also symbolic. Why? Not just at the personal level, but at the national level. Why? See how well you know Navi. Who's born in Shem? Or who originates in Shem? Yeravam ben Nevat, in his rebellion, which creates Malchut Yisrael. Because remember, the Jewish people eventually, at least for a few hundred years, split into two kingdoms. One which is in Yehuda, and one which is represented by which Shevet? Ephraim, because Yeravam starts off, is the first of the Malchei Yisrael. Ephraim is from which of the Shvatim, or which of the children of Yaakov? Yosef, who was given which land? Shem. And is that where the capital stays? So you know Tanakh? No, right? They start in Shem, and then the capital becomes Tirzah, and then the final capital of Malchut Yisrael becomes Shomron, right? Becomes Shomron. And then he notes that Shomron as well, right? We get a story like this in Navi. I'm just saying if he has the actual pasuk here. Second. So it's here in Malachim Aleph Tet Zayin Chav Daled. You get the same story that Omri goes and buys at Ahar Shomron Me'ed Shemer B'Kikarim Kesef. Right? You have another acquisition story of the buying of the final capital of Yisrael, which is Shomron. So his thesis is basically, now to summarize, is as follows. Following Ramban's theory that Bereshit is a story of Maseh Avot L'Siman L'Banim. So what we would expect is to find the Avot in some way acquiring the land that will represent Malchut Yisrael. And he says, in fact, that's what we have. Because the two cities where the Torah goes out of its way to explain how we got it and emphasize that we owned it already in the time of the Avot are Chevron and Shem. Those end up being the cities where both Malchut Yehuda and Malchut Yisrael, respectively, begin. And it's true that neither of them remain there. But he says, in the end of the day, you get a essentially Marat HaMachpelah story again when David moves the capital from Hebron to Yerushalayim, and he buys it from Arav Yevusi, and when Omri moves the kingdom that began in Shem under Yeravam from Tirza, and then eventually from Tirza to Shomron, again, you get an acquisition story of buying the land. And therefore he thinks that what is going on here is this story is meant to be understood as the prefiguring of that, right? Is that the Avot buy or acquire the land that eventually symbolize Malchut Yisrael, and when they want to take it from its temporary state to its permanent one, so they basically have to relive this story, and that's why you have this weird thing that both in the moving from Hebron, which was bought, to Yerushalayim, and the story of moving from Shem to Tirza to Shomron, which is Yaakov's claim, which is given to Yosef, but then to Malchut Yisrael, you need a new story of acquisition, because what it's doing is showing that we're building on the binyan of the Avot and concretizing it as a Jewish nation. And therefore, what you need to do, according to him, to understand it, is to constantly trace, the symbolism of these stories, and then when the symbolism gets uprooted, note that Tanakh goes out of its way to tell you a new symbolic story so that you can constantly trace the line back to Avram and Yaakov for Malchut Yehuda and Malchut Yisrael, respectively. Okay, so that is his symbolic read, which requires you to know a lot of Tanakh to catch that. But I do think it is a sharp read, especially if you're reading in the mindset of the Ramban, that you're always looking for that Maseh Avot Siman Lavanim that's going to represent the establishment of the Jewish people in the lives of the Avot. Okay.